In many respects, the dissertation element of the course should be the most attractive and stimulating and exciting element, because it's going to be almost a certainty, I would have thought, that in your future careers, whether as a lawyer or whatever, you're not going to have 2.5 months to look at something that you're interested in. Just, the luxury of 2.5 months to really get into something, right? And you should see that as quite a privilege, because it allows you to develop an expertise, and you can develop quite an expertise in 2.5 months if you think about it, and that can be extremely valuable for you going forward in your careers. In fact, I encourage students to, if their dissertation is of the right standard, to think in terms of publication. And over the years, we've had a few students who have actually managed to get their dissertations published in legal journals. Now, that really is a big help for your career. I'm sure you're aware that when you start practicing, particularly in specialist areas, if you've already got an article or something published in a respected legal journal, that can be really quite a useful thing for you. So I think in selecting your topic, right, and in working out how you're going to go about it, you shouldn't see it just as an assessment for the degree. You should see it as an opportunity to develop an expertise which will hopefully be relevant to your career going forward, and will be of benefit to that career. All right? So I think you've got to see it in a positive way. Well, I hope you will anyway. Judy has circulated some various documents to you. How many of you have actually looked at the notes on dissertation in the VLE? You have. Anyone else? Right, well, it would have helped if you had looked at them, because I'm just going to go through them very briefly. Obviously, you do need to look at the notes. So the notes are quite extensive. They go to about 30 pages, and they contain all the information you need to actually comply with the requirements, the university's requirements, and our requirements in writing the dissertation. So that's the first thing. Do, as soon as possible, go through the notes. There's a lot in them, as we'll see, relating to citation and all that. You don't have to bother with that now. Let's get your exams out of the way, all right? But when you actually come to doing your dissertation, there's a lot of advice in those notes. You've also been given a form, right? A dissertation form. Now, I don't expect you to rush into this. As I've said, it's an important opportunity for you to acquire an expertise, so I think you need to give this a great deal of thought. Now, part of the assessment, right, and this is a very important assessment, it's the mark you get for this assessment, because it is worth 2 taught modules, right? It's 60 credits, right? The mark you get for the dissertation will determine the mark you get for your degree. Right, so it's an important exercise, right? So I think it's sensible to give some thought, detailed thought, to the topic you want to do research in. And as part of the assessment, we actually look to see how sensible your decision is in selecting the topic and going about researching for it, right? As this is a master's degree, we have to show that there is a research element, and this is primarily the research element, although obviously in your MOAs there's a research element as well. So don't expect us to give you a title and say, go away and write this as a dissertation. We don't do that. It is for you to come up with the title. It is for us to say, well, we think that's impracticable. We think it'd be better to do something else. But it's for you to initiate, right? It's the ball's in your court during this assessment, right? Your supervisor won't be telling you when to come and see him or her. It will be your responsibility to contact the supervisor. If you don't, well, that's up to you, right? Okay, but so this document is to initiate the process, basically. It is for you, after you've thought about what you'd like to do research in, to put in very broad terms, all right? Not so broad as to be, unfathomable, but in broad terms, what you'd want to do research on, and a proposed area of research, and to send it. You can do it by email to your program leader. Now, your program leader will be the person who is the module leader for the module which is your core module, right? Now, you all know what your core module is, don't you? Because it is the core module which will badge your degree, all right? So you all know who is responsible or should be responsible for that core module. If you are confused, it is on the VLE, and poor Judy will point you in the right direction. So prepare this, give this some thought, perhaps even enter into a dialogue by email or directly with that person and sound them out as to whether they think it's viable or not. And then complete this form. And this enables us to take it to the next stage, which is going to be the appointment of your supervisor. All right? Now, under the university regulations, in your dissertation, you have to address a topic that is fairly within the core module. Right? So if, for example, you're doing as a core module financial regulation and compliance, then you have to pick a subject that is within the scope of financial regulation and compliance. If you're doing commercial law, then you have to pick a topic on English commercial law. And that is why I said to you at the start of the course, too late to change now, but that's what I said at the start of the course, if you wanted to do an aspect of commercial law relevant to your own jurisdiction, then you should have changed your core to comparative commercial law, all right? Because the core module for commercial law is English commercial law, all right? And of course, it may well be, if you're going to go home and practice, then you perhaps do want to introduce a dimension from your own legal system. Now, one of the difficulties of that, of course, is that not every core module admits of that. I mean, if you're doing financial regulation and compliance, that's again on UK law. We're not really interested in what might be in Indonesia or Taiwan or Thailand or whatever, So you do have to bear that in mind. This is an English law degree. And the one that does allow you some flexibility is comparative commercial law. So, has anyone got any questions about that process? Right? It's pretty straightforward. Now, dates. We will need this form back. I mean, don't rush and do it straight away, but we will need it back by the 17th, Friday, the 17th of May. Friday the 17th of May. So do make sure that you send this back to, you discuss it, you communicate with your module leader, your program leader, and then send this to Judy by this Friday the 17th of May. All right? If you don't, then the process in selecting a supervisor for you will be delayed, and you will have less time to write your dissertation. Let me emphasize that because you have a couple of months for this assessment, this exercise, there is no possibility of extensions or whatever, right? I mean, short of you sadly passing on to the next life, that's about the only excuse we accept, because you should, and I'll come on to this in a minute, you should have paced yourself in your writing your assessment that whatever happens, short of the end of the world, before the submission date, you should have something to submit. Right? Now, you actually start this process. We would have you, hopefully with a supervisor, by the 10th of June. So that's technically when your dissertation starts. But obviously, it's in your interests to find out who your supervisor is going to be, and to perhaps even had a couple of meetings with them before the 10th of June. All right? Then the dissertation has to be handed in on the 27th of August. So you have a clear couple of months. All right? Now, on the chronology, which is in the VLE, it says that submission date is the 26th, but that's a bank holiday, so it will be the 27th. All right? Now, that is not a target date. If you do not submit on the 27th, you will get a 0 mark for your dissertation. Right? So it's absolutely, that's a non-negotiable submission date. Right? Because again, part of the exercise is to show that you've got a professional attitude and professional skills, and it's no good if you're preparing papers for the court to go into the judge and say, well, I'm terribly sorry, I had a problem with my computer, or my granddad's ill, or whatever, and can I put it in tomorrow? That doesn't work, all right? So that's a date that's fixed in cement. You can't change that. So that's the date. So we need this form back by the 17th of May. Ideally before your exams or immediately after them. We will appoint a supervisor, and then you start your dissertation, and the submission date for it is the 27th of August. Now, whilst you do the dissertation, and this is particularly important for Tier 4 students, there are a number of support classes that are arranged. Right? Now, these support classes are not optional. Today is not optional. So there's a lot of people that, sadly, the compliance office is getting very tough, and the compliance office has just suspended 5 students in our course
of this program, yes,
for failing to attend 2 consecutive lectures or seminars. So it is tough. Now, these are not optional for Tier 4 students, that you have to come and sign in. If you don't, you'll be suspended. Right? And that's nothing we can do about that. We don't like being cast in the role of immigration officers, but that's the way it is. And BPP is assiduous in complying with the compliance requirements. And I think some of those 5 students are students who have been suspended because of failure to come to the current dissertation support classes. They are current students. And of course, if you're suspended, it goes on your immigration file, so next time you seek a visa, you don't get one. So, it is serious. All right? Has everybody got that? Good. Okay. Right, let's go through the notes. Now, I'm only going to go through these, the important parts, because, as I say, they're on the VLE, and you need to read them carefully, all right, and consider them. First of all, the dissertation is worth 60 credits. Now, I've just said that, so it's repetition, But it's important that you actually get that, because it is worth 2 of your electives, or 2 of your taught modules. So it's a serious exercise. Now, supervision. What does supervision mean? Well, it doesn't mean your supervisor writes your dissertation for you. Your dissertation is your dissertation. The supervisor is there to advise you. Right? Whether you take his or her advice is entirely up to you. Maybe that after a couple of weeks researching the subject, you will feel you know rather more about it than the supervisor. Now, that's not a preposterous comment. I mean, goodness me, I can't think of the last time I had 2 months to look up something. You know, I'm lucky if I have a couple of minutes to look something up. All right? Well, almost good afternoon, isn't it?
Oh, sorry.
So, you know, that's up to you, you know, how you use that time, right? And as I say, I think it's entirely plausible that after 2 or 3 weeks' work on a subject, particularly a specialist subject, you will know more about the subject in terms of just in terms of information than your supervisor. I mean, obviously, there's a whole diversity, range of subjects that you'll be doing your dissertations on. We will try and supply people who have an interest in that area and have experience, but not necessarily going to be experts, right? So the supervisor at best can offer you advice, primarily advice on how to go about writing a good dissertation and getting a good mark, and to a greater or lesser extent, depending upon the subject area, on the content of the dissertation. But it is sometimes the case that we cannot find a supervisor, I mean, particularly in regard to comparative law. You know, if somebody wants to look at, I don't know, the law relating to capacity, English law compared with that of, I don't know, some jurisdiction somewhere in the world, we may not have the expertise in that other jurisdiction, or someone certainly wouldn't have the expertise in that other jurisdiction to provide a great deal of support on the content of the law, although obviously that supervisor would be competent, or should be competent, to give you advice on how to go about research, how to go about discussion, and so on and so forth. So, as I say, we do try and appoint a supervisor, and it's a really important opportunity for you to get to know a more senior lawyer. Some of the, depending on the subject area, some of the supervisors we appoint are practitioners. We tend to be somewhat circumspect in appointing practitioners, particularly during the summer term, because so many of them are busy and, you know, it's difficult to pin them down. But we certainly do have leading practitioners, you know, the odd QC in that, who is willing to be a supervisor. But we do try and supervise as many dissertations in-house. You know, we do try and appoint as a first point of call the teaching team, simply because we know you and, you know, we know what is expected, right? We will then write to you when we've got your form and discussed it among ourselves. We will then write to you informing who your supervisor is. It is then for you to make the initial appointment with the supervisor. I mean, a lot of supervisors do in fact send you an email straight away and say, well, look, why don't we meet next Wednesday or something like that. But if you don't hear within 2 or 3 days, then, you know, you should initiate the first contact, all right? And that meeting with your supervisor, the first one, will be an important one, because it will be at that meeting you thrash out exactly what you're going to do, bearing in mind that you've got 2 months to process your dissertation, so nothing is written in stone. I mean, you can obviously change things. You can change the title. I mean, some people don't actually confirm the title in their own minds until they're about to submit it. You know, they read what it's about and they say, "Oh, that's a good title." But obviously, it is helpful to have a title in mind, a relatively specific title, because that will allow you to focus your research and your discussion. But in the nature of research, the more you go into something, the more you'll find, hopefully, interesting issues. So you may go off at tangents. Now, whether that's sensible or not, it's going to depend on the tangent. It may be that you'll start off looking at something which you think is interesting and then realise actually there's not an awful lot on it, or it's been researched to death, you know, everybody's written on it, and you don't feel there's anything much more you can do on it, and then you find something else. So, you know, it is a process of negotiation. And I would strongly advise you in that process to involve your supervisor and work with them. Now, how much contact you have with your supervisor after you set off on your road of research is entirely up to you. The compliance visa element is ticked by your compulsory attendance at the support classes, right? However, your supervisor is expected to make sure you don't clear off to Lanzarote or somewhere for 2 months, and is supposed to keep in touch with you, albeit it is your responsibility to ensure that happens. Now, you've missed most of it, but that's up to you, because as I've been saying to everybody, this assessment is very much in your hands. It varies with regard to contact with supervisors. You know, you can have a lot of contact, obviously, through email. It may not be necessary to meet more than 2 or 3 times, but you know, it very much depends on the subject area. It very much depends on the rapport you develop with your supervisor. But as I said, it is a real opportunity for you to get together, get to know and work with a senior lawyer. And, you know, obviously that relationship can be important in the future in terms of references, in terms of your future career. So you know, that's another consideration for you in selecting your topic. What happens if you can't stand your supervisor? Well, you have to come and see me then, or Judy. Of course, maybe you can't stand me. So, and then, I'm sure there's procedures in BPP for that kind of thing. So anyway, we try and obviously be as facilitative as possible. Can you do your research? Can you go home and do your research? Can you go off to Lanzarote for two months and do your research on the beach? Well, officially no. On the other hand, I recognise that if you are doing comparative research, it may be necessary, it may be desirable for you to go and access to materials that you can't access easily here. The official line, as far as BPP is concerned, that you are still technically residents and you are expected to be here. If you decide to go home to do your research, you can, but we will have to inform compliance and they will withdraw sponsorship from you. That doesn't affect your ability to present your dissertation for your degree. What it means is your visa to study here is effectively revoked. That's not a negative thing, you know, it doesn't affect you going forward, but bear in mind that if you do decide you want to go home and do your research, then that is it, right? Okay, you do it all from there. And, you know, with the best within the world, it is difficult to provide adequate supervision if you're not here, right? And we make that clear to you, right? So I don't really recommend that. Extensions, well, as I said, you know, short of divine intervention, you don't get extensions because you have over 2 months, and part of the exercise is you pacing yourself, you organising your work. So therefore, coming to see us 3 days before submission and saying, oh, well, such and such has happened, is actually irrelevant. All right? So, no extensions. Submission procedure. Now, you are required to submit hard copy. All right? Now, there is a move within the BPP, as there is in many other universities, to require you to submit electronically. And it could be that during the summer, somebody in quality assurance or something will say, no, we're going to move over from hard copy to electronic submission. We have actually resisted that for 2 reasons. First of all, one primary reason, and that is that all electronic submissions go automatically through a process of Turnitin. Now, I don't know whether any of you are familiar with this, but this is basically an electronic surveillance program which identifies with great accuracy and precision any not appropriately cited material. So not just material that has been copied, plagiarized, but which has not been cited appropriately. Our concern is, and of course, it kicks it out. So our concern is if we adopt that approach, then a lot of students may find that significant chunks of their dissertation have been rejected and they fail. Right? So it makes sense, if we are actually going to have an electronic system, to have early submission, and frankly that is not workable within our timetable. Right? That's the reason why we still require physical copy. All right? So it's in your interests. Now, having said that, does that mean that we don't use Turnitin? The university selects and certainly targets, on the basis of previous performance, dissertations, and then does run it through Turnitin. And that brings me on to the absolutely vital point of citation. Now, there's a lot in the notes about how to cite material. In fact, to avoid allegations of plagiarism, it's not, and we give you a whole, there's a whole discussion. Stuart Basie gives you a whole seminar on what plagiarism is. Plagiarism is not just copying chunks out of someone else's work, right? Plagiarism is not appropriately citing ideas. And the reality is, to protect yourself from allegations of plagiarism, you do need to be careful in citing the sources of both the ideas you refer to and the material you refer to. All right? Now, again, and this is a controversial area, and I don't really want to go into it in too much detail, as I say Stuart does. But there are arguably cultural differences in the way things are taught. Now, I mean, I teach in a number of universities in China, for example. Now, there, almost as a sign of respect, you regurgitate the views of your superiors or senior people. Yeah, that's accepted. Well, that's not accepted in the Western tradition. Right? It is, of course, accepted if you put that in speech marks and you then reference it and show that it's not your work, it's someone else's work, but then you can't have a dissertation which is completely someone else's work. All right? So there are those issues. So, I mean, if anyone, I would hope by now that none of you are at sea in regard to what is involved in plagiarism, but we will look at it in more detail. But citation is absolutely critical. What happens if there is inadequate citation? Well, you have to sign a statement saying that you have complied with the citation procedures and it is not plagiarized. If you sign that falsely, then that is fraud. Now, I take a very dim view of lawyers, potential lawyers, trying to defraud me. And I have on occasions not bothered with the university disciplinary procedures. I've just reported the matter to the police and, in the case of practitioners from overseas, written to their Chief Justice. And in a couple of cases, people have actually lost their professional qualifications as a consequence of that. So again, it's pretty serious. It's not just, oh, well, I made a mistake. It is serious, right? We regard it as a very serious academic offence. And in fact, those of you who read the newspapers, you will see that there is a lot of pressure within the universities in the United Kingdom to make it actually a very specific criminal offence. All right? So plagiarism is a no-no. And it can not only have very adverse impact on this assessment, it can seriously damage your health in terms of your professional career. All right? Because if you are a practitioner or you aspire to be a practitioner, then it may well be something that is brought up, all right, in the future. So be careful. The dissertation has a strict word limit. Again, it is not us being pedantic. It is to see whether you can take a subject, develop the subject, and write about it in a cogent and sensible way within a specific word limit. And the word limit is 10,000 words. That is strict. Believe it or not, people do actually count the words, so don't, try and gloss that. And the obvious issue is, well, what is included in the word limit and what is not? And I've set out in the notes exactly what are included. So please note that the following is included. The body of the work, that is your text. The preface, so don't go rambling on thanking everybody you've ever met. The introduction, titles, subheadings, footnotes, endnotes, references, appendices, and supporting evidence. Right? There are certain things which we do not count within the word limit, and that is the bibliography. Now, the bibliography, again, is important for two reasons. First of all, it ties into what I've just said about plagiarism, but also the bibliography shows to the reader the extent and depth of your research. Now, when you conduct research, and you've all to some extent done research or engaged in research, and you will get advice on that, be circumspect on how viable your selected topic is for research. All right? So don't pick a subject which is so airy-fairy no one's ever looked at it, or is going to require such in-depth research in texts and documents that are not generally or freely available, or involves discussion of matters which you are not going to get access to. So be sensible that you can reference the relevant literature, and of course record it in the bibliography and by citation. As a rule of thumb, I take the view that you probably need at least 5 or 6 footnotes at the end of each page, referring to discussion in textbooks, practitioners' books, legal articles, learned journals. Obviously, there is a hierarchy of sources. Newspapers, that kind of thing, are informative, but they're not authoritative. Obviously, if you're dealing with stuff that's on the internet, you have to be extremely careful in terms of citation, in terms of referencing, in terms of the standing of that material. Right? So that whole process is a difficult one, and one that you've got to master. That is part of the exercise. Also not included in the word count are case lists, statute lists, and where there is a bit of ambiguity, that is material in foreign languages. Now, obviously, if you're writing on Islamic law or whatever, you may want to actually include the original Arabic, or you may want to, if you're doing Chinese law, to include the original Chinese. Now, this will obviously be an assistance to the examiner, and generally that's not counted, but it should be something that you discuss with your supervisor. How do we examine your dissertation? Well, obviously examining a dissertation is not an easy process. Your supervisor will be one of the examiners, and that has bearing on what I've said before about that your supervisor is there to advise you, and you don't have to take his or her advice. But do bear in mind, they are also an examiner. Right? So if you decide not to take your supervisor's advice on something, then make sure that you convince him or her that you were right in your dissertation, right? Because, as I say, they will examine you. We also appoint a second examiner who, again, will be an expert or have some familiarity with the subject area, and they both examine blindly. They're not influenced by either. All right? And you would be surprised that in the vast majority of cases, I would say, 80% of cases, the marks are almost identical. Right? Where there is a discrepancy, then we moderate them. A third person will look at them. Right? And then all those marks go to an external examiner. That's somebody not involved in this process, somebody outside the university. Again, usually somebody who is quite a well-known expert in the area. And they will check whether they agree with the marks of the two internal examiners. And then it all goes to an examination board, actually two boards, an internal board and then an external board. So we do take the marking of your essays, your dissertations, very seriously. All right? And of course, as with other assessments, once that mark has gone to the boards, then that is final. Now, I have listed for you on the notes what the examiners are looking for. Very basically, they're looking for a topic that has been sensibly and sensitively selected, right? So they think, oh, well, that's interesting. The candidate has actually thought about this, has actually given some thought to the development of law in this area. And then they're looking for clear evidence that the candidate has acquired expertise, knowledge, but also application. Right? Is able to apply the law, is able to understand the law, is able to understand where the laws come from, what the problems are in its application, where it might be going. Right? And has then presented that in a readable manner. And for a readable manner, you've got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, I always say to my students, and other supervisors have different views, that you've got 10,000 words, not bad to regard it 10 chapters, 2,000 words each. 2,000 words is very easy to write when you think about it. Right? Bear in mind, though, that each sentence, is considered in terms of an assessment, so don't put a lot of gaff in it. All right? So you've got 5 chapters, and you structure it in that way. You have an introductory chapter where you discuss what the issues are, what you're looking at. You have another chapter, perhaps putting it in context. You have 2 chapters actually discussing the issues, and a final chapter by way of conclusion. It's not rocket science. You're not writing PhDs, so you don't have to make an original contribution to the study of the subject. You don't have to come up with something no one else has thought of. well, these days you don't have to do that with PhDs, but I mean, you don't worry about what other people have written in the area or whatever. You're there to basically put what you think into the process, all right? And therefore, in the conclusion and throughout the dissertation, we want to see what you think, all right? We want to see whether you've actually understood the issues and perhaps have come up with perspectives or issues that others perhaps haven't, although that's not a test of the strength of the dissertation. We say that we place emphasis on analysis rather than description. Well, that's true, but of course in many areas of the law, particularly comparative, they are essentially descriptive processes, right? So try and be analytical. Don't just, ramble on in a descriptive way. Try and be analytical, but we do accept that obviously you have to set the stage, right? So, and there's different ways of writing your dissertation, but I think the ability to take the issues, to recognise the issues, to structure your discussion, and for the reader, because, obviously you appreciate we have to read a lot of these things, to after they've read it to say, well, that's interesting. I don't agree with it, but that's interesting. That's a distinction. All right. And so it is. It is like anything else, anything that you read. It's got to keep your interest. Now, having said that, sensationalism and comic remarks and all that are not acceptable, all right? This is a serious exercise. So you've got to write it in a formal way. Now, I always say a good way of approaching this is, in your minds, think about writing this as a dissertation or whatever to a senior judge in your jurisdiction. So you're not going to start off with and all this and put pictures in and, tell stories about your grandma and all that. It's a formal process, right? It's got to be a formal, structured process. It's serious, all right? Mustn't be sensational, mustn't be colloquial, avoid colloquialisms, avoid jokes, and so on and so forth. So, it's a serious process. Now, again, I've put advice for you specifically on content, on style, on expression. Read it. Now, again, we're concerned to try and see how far your cognitive skills have developed, and I put a list there of what we look for. We look and see what your aims and objectives are in the work. Methodology. Now, an awful lot of nonsense is spoken about methodology. If you're doing a PhD in social sciences today, a great emphasis is placed on how you've gone about your research. Well, I'm always a bit equivocal about this in law because, we do our research basically looking at other people's ideas, other people's works, and whether they be expressed in a case by a judge or in some learned article or whatever. So I'm rather lukewarm about the methodological aspect to these dissertations. Some people would say that out of those five chapters, one should be on methodology. Unless you are actually doing primary research, which I would strongly advise you not to do. You do get people say, I'm going to do a survey. I'm going to write off to here, there, there. Well, we have enough difficulty persuading you to answer our surveys, right? So the reality is that you ain't going to get anyone of any consequence respond to you, and therefore your survey is going to be meaningless, and come just before submission date, you're going to have be stressed out and either have to make it up or whatever. It doesn't work, right? You're not in a position, I don't think, to do primary research. You do get occasional opportunities. For a few years ago, there was a woman student who had been a police officer, and she was looking at basically how evidence was, how the assurance of integrity of evidence could be established in court. And she went back and she did some more field work, and she went back to her. But that's rather different. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I doubt whether many of you would have that kind of access. All right? So I think field research, no, is a bit of a no-no. Statistical research is very difficult. Primary survey research, I would avoid it. Right? But it's up to you. You may have some special skill that you want to impress us with. But if not, then the methodology is going to be traditional legal scholarship. All right? Because we are looking in the ultimate for evidence of scholarship, that is expertise and traditional scholarship, but also practical application. Now, I've put in here a lot about plagiarism. Do read that. And also be careful of, this is not so much a problem in the dissertation because of the relationship with the supervisor. It's more a problem actually when you do your MOAs, and that is where you get together and work together. Now, this is a difficult topic because, of course, most lawyers do work with other people. They don't just go off and write their briefs on their own. If you are a lawyer, you interact with other lawyers. So this whole process is a difficult one for us to manage. Of course, it is a good idea for you to bounce off other people your ideas, and particularly with your supervisor and perhaps other supervisors. In some cases, we've appointed multiple supervisors to help the student in their subject area. But at the end of the day, it has to be your work. And you would be surprised how good we are at actually detecting when it's not your work. All right? And for goodness sake, don't go off to one of these outfits that sells you ready-made dissertations. I'm sure none of you would, but I've had somebody, not at this university, do that, and they'd made the mistake actually of doing it at a university where they'd got their first degree from as well, and then put this dissertation in and written by somebody else, and they claimed it was their own. So they were kicked out of that current degree, and the university took away their first degree. So, after 4.5 years of study, they ended up with their O-levels. So don't do that. It is daft. And of course, you've got to ask the question: what is the caliber of the people that actually write these essays for these essay companies? I mean, they're not going to be at the cutting edge, are they? If you're doing well as a lawyer, you don't hire yourself out for writing people's essays. So most of them are pretty low standards anyway. Academic referencing, bibliography, citation. There's a lot in the notes there. I'm not going to go through it all. You've already had at least 1 or 2 lectures on citation. There was one, I think, during the reduction, and then there's been another one in regard to the MOA. So you should be aware of citation. There's basically 2 processes. There's the traditional legal process of citation, which is footnotes at the bottom of each page, and then there's the more kind of sociological approach, the Harvard approach, where you put a reference, you name the author in the text, and then you put the references as endnotes. There is a tendency in the academy to move over to the Harvard method. I don't personally think it is appropriate for serious legal research. If you're reading something and it's a logical argument and you're concentrating, the most you want to do is to scan down to the bottom of the page. You don't want to go flicking through the back and trying to tie it up. So I would strongly advise you to adopt the footnote approach and to make sure you comply with the advice that's given you in these notes in regard to citation. All right? It's not all, as I say, I've perhaps kind of over-egged it today, telling you all the things where you can go wrong. But that's to terrify you all. The reality, it should be an enjoyable process. It should be an interactive process with your supervisor, and it should be an opportunity for you to either confirm an expertise that you had before you got here. I wouldn't expect anyone to pick up any expertise here, or something that you're interested in, that we've skirted over in class, and you thought, oh, well, that's interesting. It doesn't have to be something you've learnt here, all right? Provided it is fairly within, and we're quite imaginative and Catholic, as long as it's fairly within the idea, the concept of the core module. All right? Any questions? No? Well, that's good. Well, I will leave it there then. There is one other thing that I would like to say now.
She has a question.
Oh, you got a question, right?
Will we write an MOA
What?
within the term?
Sorry?
Will we write an MOA?
Oh, no. You don't do an MOA on the dissertation. No. So, no, there's just the dissertation. There are a couple of other things I should remember. That don't, in your dissertation, and I'm sure your supervisor will emphasise this to you, don't leave it towards the end of the period to submit work to your supervisor. There is quite a strong rule. Again, it's for your protection, actually. It's to stop you having nervous breakdowns. That we will not comment in detail on material submitted to us within 3 weeks of the submission date. And that is because if for the first time you send us your material and we write back to you and say it's rubbish, that's not going to help you. Right? So if you've been daft enough not to take advantage of your supervisor's advice during the 2 months that you have to research and write your dissertation, then we take the view that within 3 weeks of submission, there's not really much we can do. All right, and we don't want you when you go for mitigation to say, well, it was caused by my supervisor saying it's a load of old rubbish. Right? So make sure you pace yourself in seeking advice.
The dissertation that we write, can we submit it to publish it?
I'm sorry you've missed it, Joanne. There's really no point in coming here just having questions now. Okay.
Yeah. Can we publish our dissertation after we submit it here? Can we submit it to publish for any journal or any?
Yes, as I've said, I think that's very positive.
So it's not restricted just to our degree.
No. I mean, you have the copyright. I've published the odd piece in journals that I've been associated with, and I mean others have published them. Yeah. And I think it's a very positive thing, yes. And your supervisor may be prepared to give you specific advice in regard to publication. All right? Right. Another matter, totally separate from this. It is totally separate. And that is, you may have seen, because Judy put on the BLE yesterday, an invitation to you all concerning the Cambridge Symposium on Economic Crime. This is a conference. It's a very, it's a conference, we call it a symposium, because it's in Cambridge. And it's quite an extensive programme. I think it runs to, nearly 50 pages of content. It's in its 37th year, so it's been going, it's an annual conference. And we host it at Jesus College within the University of Cambridge, and it regularly attracts about 2,000 participants from around the world. An awful lot of attorney generals, judges, senior judges. For example, because whenever one ever does this, it always ends in disaster. Somebody from their jurisdiction asked me if anyone's coming. What jurisdiction? Ghana, yes. Well, the Attorney General comes, the Minister of Justice, and usually 2 Supreme Court judges. So serious. Anyone else? Vietnam. Vietnam, more problematic, but we have usually the General Counsel to the Vietnamese mission here, the embassy, and we certainly in the past have had people from Vietnam.
From Ukraine.
Ukraine, yes, we have people from your intelligence service and also people from the Prosecutor General's office. So anyway, it's, as I say, it's totally international. Do have a look at the programme if you're interested on the VLE. It's very extensive. Go through it. And what we do, we offer as a special thing for BPP, we take 10 or up to 10 students from the LLM at BPP as members of the Secretariat, because the symposium is organised on a non-profit making basis, so no one gets paid, and we're not in a position to cover air fares and transportation costs. But if you're in the UK or you can come to the UK, then we will cover your travel costs within the UK, and we will put you up in the University of Cambridge at Jesus College for a whole week, which is actually slightly longer than a week, it's a week and a day, and you'll get all your meals, and you'll have your meals with the Attorney General from Ghana and other people in the hall. There's a great emphasis on the formalities. You know, there's a formal dinner every evening with speeches and so on and so forth. You'll see from the programme. So it is a unique opportunity for students to meet people from their own jurisdiction, but also to meet people from many intergovernmental organisations. All the relevant intergovernmental organisations are there: the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Arab Bank. All these banks are there, and also to meet lawyers from all around the world. A lot of the big international law firms. I mean, all the major law firms in the UK are there, and from America and internationally, and from China. So it is a great opportunity. Now, as I say, it's non-profit make, it's non-commercial, so we rely on what we euphemistically refer to as the Secretariat, which is about 80 students. Most of them are PhD students, although a lot of them have actually come back over the years. So we actually do have the odd High Court judge and QC and the odd former Attorney General as members of the Secretariat who've come back every year. So it is a totally cosmopolitan group, the Secretariat, and the Secretariat runs the symposium. They meet at 11 o'clock on the Saturday before it starts. It then starts on the Sunday. It's a very intense week. It's hard work. You know, there's the breakfast you have to have breakfast before 7, don't you? Or is it at 7? Well, breakfast at 7, and then the bar remains open to 2 in the morning. And of course, if your Attorney General wants you to sit down and discuss great issues of the legal system with you, you may end up sitting with them all evening, all night. So it's a lot of hard work, but it's an incredible opportunity for young lawyers. And as I say, we make this offer of joining the Secretariat available internationally, so students from all over the world. I mean, I had somebody write to me this morning, actually, from Switzerland, another 2 from Turkey yesterday. So I mean, it's from all over the world, but we earmark 10 places for BPP students, right? And, you know, we can go slightly above the 10 if people are really enthusiastic. We don't select you, so it's not we need your CVs. We would make recommendations, and then Cambridge University selects you, all right, for the Secretariat. But as I said, we've got 10 places, so it's something that, you know, we can easily facilitate. I think it is. I mean, the details of how to apply are on the VLE, and yeah. So it's and of course, obviously the dissertation has to be in before, so it shouldn't shouldn't interfere with that. I mean, the organisations that support it in the UK, for example, are the National Crime Agency, the National Economic, because it's on economic, I forgot to tell you what it was on, didn't I? Economic crime. But it's in the very broadest sense. It's economically motivated misconduct. So we deal with, as you might imagine, things like money laundering, corruption, but we also deal with slavery, we deal with the dark web, and a whole raft of issues. The National Economic Crime Centre, Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, the Serious Fraud Office, the Crown Prosecution Service, Scotland Yard, City of London Police, and the UK Treasury. So that gives you some idea, and the University of Cambridge. So that gives you some idea of the level. I mean, it's opened by the UK Attorney General and the UK Finance Minister. So, but it is not just governmental. You'll see from the programme, there's an awful lot of practitioners there and other people. So if you are interested, you may want to express your interest to Judy and put in an application as soon as possible. We don't do it on a first come, first served basis, but certainly getting it in early does help. All right, so think about it. All right, and it's not just.
You must be 100% convinced.
Yes, because we get probably 30 applicants per place. So it is very disappointing if we do allocate a place to somebody and then the week before or whatever they pull out. And frankly, I would take a very dim view of that. So if that happens, don't ask me for a reference. All right, so be certain you really want to do it. And that. But I do think that it is a unique opportunity, and there is a very high proportion of people that come back because they see it as so valuable, and it means you're part of an international network. Right. Okay. Any questions? No. Good. Right.
Yes.
Oh, okay, right. Well, you
have a
but do
topic
think
for
about it
where is
carefully.
Oh. You need to discuss with your core modulator. What is your core? What's the driver?
I was thinking about bringing USB back to it, and I forgot to. USB for copying the record.
Oh, maybe you can copy like after we finish